Hello, this is Dr. Morris. I'm doing a media review on the information that will be covered in Exam 2 for A&P number 2. This material will cover primarily the endocrine system. There also is some remainder of the neurological system that we'll need to finish as well. The chapters covered on this review are listed on your syllabus. I'll go over some very key points for the lecture portion, and then I'll move on to the laboratory portion of the course as well. For the lecture portion of the course, again, we'll be studying the endocrine system and portions of the neurosystem. There are a number of various hormones that will be very important for you to be able to know and know the function of those and know what target cells or target organs these hormones work on. I'll begin with antidiuretic hormone, also referred to as ADH. You should know the function of antidiuretic hormone, and you certainly should know where it's produced at. That will also be important for the lab portion of the exam. Many times I'll show you an organ and I'll ask you what hormone is produced from that organ, or I may ask you if this is the target for a specific hormone. Another hormone that's important for you to know is aldosterone. You should know where aldosterone is produced. You should know what electrolyte is important in the regulation of in the body. It's a hormone that's also produced in a particular organ, and you should be able to identify the organ where aldosterone is produced. I'll list several other hormones as well that you should be familiar with. The parathyroid hormone. You should be familiar with somatotropin. You should be familiar with thymosin. So all hormones produced, you should know where they're produced at and what their function is. The pituitary gland is an important site of hormone production. Prolactin is a hormone that is produced there, and it has several functions and it has several target organs. You should be familiar with that. You should be familiar with where thyroid-stimulating hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and growth hormone are produced. You should also know their primary function in the human body as well. You should be familiar with the hormone thyroxine. You should be familiar with where it is produced at, and you should be familiar with what the target cells or target organs are for that hormone. You should be familiar with insulin, and you should be familiar with glucagon. More specifically, where is it produced at, what cells typically produce insulin and glucagon. You should be familiar with the hormone calcitonin. You should know where it's produced at and what its effect is on the body. You should be familiar with cortisol and where is cortisol produced at in the body. You should know how hormones work in the human body. You should know typically when you compare hormones to, say, the electrical impulses of the nervous system, hormones are more like medicines. They're introduced into the bloodstream. They have to travel through the bloodstream and go to a target organ. So at the point of secretion of the hormone, there typically is a bit of a delay between the hormone release and the subsequent response. Hormones may also bind to specific sites. So you should know a general concept of hormones in the body and how hormones work. Do hormones bind to one cell, two cells, a number of cells? You should know that mechanism that's involved. You should be familiar with I'm sorry, lost my train of thought there. You should be familiar with the adrenal hormones, norepinephrine, dopamine, where they're produced at. You should be familiar with the regions referred to as zona reticularis, zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and what exactly are the hormones that are produced in those areas. You should be familiar with the dynamics of the kidney, what hormones are produced in the kidneys, such as erythropoietin is produced in the kidneys. You should also be familiar with the location of the kidney and a gland that sits on the top of the kidney, the adrenal gland, and you should be familiar with the areas of the adrenal gland as mentioned. You should be familiar with the substances that are secreted from the adrenal gland. I guess I did that in reverse order. I should have talked about that and then talked about epinephrine, norepinephrine. But just be familiar with those locations. On the laboratory portion of the exam, I'd ask you to identify the kidney and maybe some of the hormones that are produced in the kidney. I may ask you to identify the adrenal gland and maybe even the zones of the adrenal gland and ask you to tell me what hormones are produced there. You should be familiar with, and I may have mentioned it already if I have not, the hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin is produced in a particular organ, in a particular region of the organ, and you should be familiar with that, and you should also be familiar with the target cells or the target tissue systems related to oxytocin. I believe I mentioned calcitonin as well. If I didn't, you should be familiar with calcitonin and how is that significant in the regulation of the calcium ion in the body. I believe I already mentioned parathyroid hormone, insulin, and glucagon as well. You should also be familiar with the estrogens and the hormones estrogen and testosterone, where these hormones are produced at, and what are their effects on the body. You should be familiar with the roles, and I know I already mentioned epinephrine and norepinephrine. You should be familiar with where they're secreted at and what is their role in the body. They have two roles. Most of what we've talked about has been hormones. However, norepinephrine and epinephrine also have a second role as well that you should be familiar with. You should be familiar with the following diseases: goiter, Addison's disease, diabetes mellitus, Cushing's disease, and diabetes insipidus. You should be familiar with those diseases. You should know what's meant by a simple endocrine reflex, what that involves. You should be familiar with the testicles and the hormone produced in the testicles. I mentioned it already earlier. What specific cells in the testicles are responsible for the production of that hormone? Should be familiar with growth hormone. Exactly what is the role of growth hormone? What exactly does it do in the body? You should be familiar with the effect of decreased blood flow to the kidney. Now, decreased blood flow to the kidney causes a cascade of reactions to take place. Many of these reactions are hormone regulated. You should be familiar with the role of renin, erythropoietin, and angiotensin when the blood flow to the kidney has been reduced. All of these hormones will have a specific reaction to compensate for this decreased blood flow. Should be familiar with the target cells related to insulin. Target cells related to insulin. Remember, insulin works all over the body, so be familiar with that mechanism. You should be familiar with what happens to a person that has diabetes mellitus that goes untreated. You should be familiar with the effect of insulin not only produced inside the body, but if insulin is given exogenously, or if it's produced, a man-made insulin is injected, what the effect in the body would be. Typically, that's going to be the same as the insulin that's produced inside the body as well. Should be familiar with the term catecholamines. I've already talked about those earlier. You should be familiar with the disease condition. I think I said these already. I know I did. Goiter, Addison's disease, diabetes insipidus, and diabetes mellitus. Let's see. You should be familiar with the luteinizing hormone. Where is it produced at, and what is its role? Let me digress into some remnants of the nervous system that we had to discuss. There are two primary systems that we discuss in the autonomic nervous system. And you should be familiar with the term autonomic nervous system. There are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. You should be very familiar with those two systems, exactly what is the physiological response when these systems are innervated. When the parasympathetic nervous system is innervated, what takes place in the body? What signs, symptoms would you see? Same with the sympathetic nervous system. When it's stimulated, what exactly would be the response that you would see in the body? You should be familiar with, the special senses in the body. Remember, there are certain special senses in the body that affect our perception of our environment. Those special senses include smell, vision. There are a couple of other ones there that are listed. So be familiar with all of the special senses. Should be familiar with the dynamics of the eye, not only the basic anatomy of the eye, but also the pupil, the conjunctiva, the posterior chamber, the cornea, and the anterior chamber of the eye. Specifically, what are the roles of each of those regions of the eye? The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system go by two other names. You should be familiar with the other terms that are used when we talk about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Remember, these other names are related to the position of the nerves, actually where they come off of the spinal cord. Do they come off at the cervical region, the lumbar, the thoracic region? But the names that are associated with those nervous systems relate to where the majority of the nerves come off of the nervous system. So that's important to know as well. One of the systems is referred to as the flight or fight system. The other system is referred to as the rest and digest system. Should know what's meant by those terms. You should also be familiar with the organ. I'm going to go back to the endocrine system now. You should also be familiar with the organ, the pancreas. Remember, the pancreas has an endocrine function and an exocrine function. You should know what I mean by that. You should be familiar with the effect of thyroid hormone and how the thyroid hormone is important in the regulation of metabolism in the body. You should be familiar with what's referred to as the general adaptation syndrome, or GAS. There are several phases involved in the GAS. You should have a basic understanding of each of the phases related to this syndrome. You should know the specific role of erythropoietin, angiotensin, atrial natriuretic peptide, where these hormones are produced at and what the effect in the body. Jump back to the nervous system again. The cerebellum. It relies on significant information from other parts of the body. You should know what the role of the cerebellum is. And when I say it relies on information from other parts of the body for it to function, what do I mean by that? You should be familiar with the disease condition anencephaly. Anencephaly. You should be familiar with the term hydrocephaly. And you should be familiar with the term encephalitis. You should be familiar with the pyramidal system. The pyramidal system. Pyramidal, pyramidal system. It controls muscles, specific type of muscles, and a specific type of function in these muscles, and you should be familiar with that. The corticospinal tract is related to the pyramidal system, and you should be familiar with just the basic construct of the corticospinal system, just the basic. You should know the effect of a sympathomimetic medication. Sympathomimetic medication, remember, will mimic the sympathetic nervous system. So if you know what takes place in the sympathetic nervous system, you will know how sympathomimetic medications work. You should be familiar with the disease process known as Alzheimer's disease. You should know what types of findings you would see on diagnostic studies. What are the typical signs and symptoms of it? What are the etiology of the disease or the cause of the disease? You should be familiar with the following plexuses in the body as it relates to sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The hypogastric plexus, the cardiac plexus, the celiac plexus. Those are some important plexuses that you should be familiar with. You should also be familiar with what's referred to as beta blockers or beta-1 adrenergic blockers. You should be familiar with nicotinic cholinergic receptors in drugs that would affect nicotinic cholinergic receptors. You should be familiar with alpha-1 adrenergic receptors and then alpha-1 blockers. Now, that covers all the material that will be asked to you on the exam, the lecture portion of the exam at least. I'm going to go to the laboratory portion of the exam. I'm going to actually put up a PowerPoint for you here. Give me just a moment to load that PowerPoint up. Just a moment. It's loading. It's loading. Okay. Oops. That's not sure you want to see that. Okay. Here it is. This is the right one. All right. So let's start with the laboratory portion of the exam. Sure, I got the right. Oops, sorry, don't have the right one up yet. Just a moment. Just a moment. Sorry. Oh, there it is. Okay. Window back up. Okay. This is the course documents file for the virtual anatomy lab. As you can see on the first slide, you're looking at an image here of the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. You should know the hypothalamus. What's the role of the hypothalamus? This is referred to as the stalk. A portion of the stalk is referred to as the infundibulum. Remember, this stalk actually has a connection, direct connection with the hypothalamus, and divides into two parts of the pituitary gland, the anterior portion and the posterior portion. I would expect you to be able to identify the various portions of the pituitary gland, both the anterior and posterior. You should be familiar with the hormones that are produced in the anterior portion of the pituitary gland and the two hormones that are produced in the posterior aspect of the pituitary gland. This is another picture I believe will be on your exam. Basically looks at the blood flow to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Should be able to label the superior hypophyseal artery and the inferior hypophyseal artery. Notice the direct connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior portion of the pituitary gland. But as you see, direct blood circulation from the hypothalamus to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland actually is not there. There is a neuroendocrine, what we refer to as a neuroendocrine connection here from the paraventricular nuclei and the supraocular nuclei, which stimulate the production of these two hormones that are here in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So you should be familiar with the dynamics of this photograph. There are several questions related to the anatomy and the circulation of the thyroid gland. You should be familiar with this picture. Should be familiar with the circulation, the inferior thyroid artery, the superior thyroid artery, as it provides blood flow to the thyroid gland. You should be able to identify the various lobes of the thyroid gland, the isthmus, and the right and left lobe of the thyroid gland. This is a photograph of the kidney and a superior structure, the adrenal gland. Should be able to identify the kidney, obviously, and then tell me what hormones are produced here. Again, I may put an arrow on the kidney and ask you if a given hormone is produced there. So I would expect you to know what hormones are produced in this organ. And then in the adrenal gland, same is correct. There are various hormones that are produced here that you should know. This is a cross-section. This is a cross-section of the adrenal gland. The cortex and medulla should be able to identify the two parts. And then if you look further down in the adrenal gland, as I mentioned on the lecture portion of the exam, there are zones. The zona reticularis, zona fasciculata, and the zona glomerulus, all responsible for the production of specific hormones that you should be familiar with. Posterior aspect of the thyroid gland demonstrates some other glands as well. These are referred to as the parathyroid hormone, the parathyroid gland, which produces the parathyroid hormone. You should know the role of that hormone. This is a very significant organ in digestion. The pancreas has both an exocrine and an endocrine function. Should be familiar with the hormones that are produced here in this organ. There are some specific cell types in this organ as well. The pancreatic islet are the Isles of Langerhans, responsible for the production of insulin. I would expect you to know that. There are also alpha cells here. They're responsible for the production of glucagon. I would expect you to know that as well. The endocrine function, again, is the hormone function. There's also an exocrine function here. The pancreatic duct supplies digestive enzymes into the GI tract to assist in the digestion of food. So those are going to be the major organs that I will ask you to identify for the purposes of the exam. Remember, not only do you have to be able to identify the organs and the structure, but I may ask you what hormones are produced in each one of those organs, and you should be able to answer those correctly. Now, there are 50 questions, I believe, on the lecture portion of the exam. And for the lab portion, I'll post it on Blackboard. I believe there are 20-plus questions on the lab portion of the exam. You'll have ample enough time to be able to answer this. The lecture portion is all multiple choice. The lab portion of the exam actually has an arrow and a little box to click, so it's a point-and-click type of exam, similar to what you took in the first exam. I hope this helps you. Please continue studying. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.